Good morning, welcome back. Today is February 27th, and yes, it is snowing out again. I think I really only pick days that are snowing to film this. I don't know, something about my, good luck or what. But it is snowing, so we're still inside. Today, February 27th, we are this close to being done with February. Looking into spring starts next month, so just throwing that out there. But what happened on this date, February 27th in history? Well, first of all, it was on this date in 1531 that the Schmalkaldic League was formed in what we call today Germany. Actually, it was referred to as the Holy Roman Empire at the time, which I believe it was Voltaire who pointed out that it was neither Holy Roman or an empire. But regardless, the Holy Roman Empire was made up of a group of city-states. It was more of a confederation than necessarily a unified country per se. And the leader was Charles V, but at the point, in 1531, the leader was Charles V. And the Schmalkaldic League was a northern territory of these German city-states that were Protestant. In order to be a part of the Schmalkaldic League, you had to ascribe to the Augsburg Confession, which was one of the early Protestant creeds. And it was formed in opposition to a certain extent to Charles V and the Catholic hegemony of the Pope and all that at the time. It wasn't entirely successful, started a war, and that didn't end well. About 15 years later, but the Schmalkaldic League started on this date in 1531. It was on this date in 1813 that the U.S. passed the Vaccine Act of 1813. Okay, now this had to do with the smallpox vaccine. Now, again, remember we had talked about smallpox a week or so ago when we talked about Cotton Mather, and the concept of being vaccinated against smallpox went back for about 100 years. But previously what had been done is you would cut yourself, and kind of make a little cut in your arm, and you would literally put smallpox, pus or something from actual smallpox, and you would force yourself to catch smallpox in a minor way. And it was Edward Jenner in 1796 who realized and discovered that you could use cowpox, a very similar disease to smallpox, and it would serve the same function. And so cowpox was a much milder disease relative to human beings, and so a person could take that vaccine and be protected from getting smallpox. Well, what happened is shortly after that, there were a lot of people creating false vaccines. And so in 1813, the U.S. government created this federal agent to ensure the safe distribution of vaccines. Now, on the one hand, it didn't end well, again, kind of like the Schmalkaldic League. It didn't end well. It only lasted about 8 years. But it was just too difficult at that time in 1813 for this particular agency, to safely guard against abuses of the system. But it does set up an interesting question or an interesting fact, and that is that 200 years ago, the federal government saw one of its roles as being the personal health of its citizens. And I only say that because I know within the last couple of years, there has been some question in the U.S. about whether the government really is doing the right thing in putting itself in the middle of a virus protection thing. Well, they've been doing it since 1813. Today in 1933 is the day of the Reichstag fire in Germany. Now this fire, the Reichstag, is like the government building, like the U.S. Capitol in the U.S. And it caught on fire on this date in 1833. And it was about 4 weeks after Adolf Hitler had taken over as the Chancellor of Germany. And he was able to use this event as a means, I guess, or as a rallying call to basically impose martial law and essentially and solidify his control, thus creating what came to be known as Nazi Germany. And so that just kind of gives you an example of from 90 years ago of a government using something as a pretext. But that was on this date in 1933. Today is Constantine the Great's birthday. Constantine the Great, born on this date in 272. Constantine is the Roman Empire who converted to Christianity. He did not make Christianity legal or the official religion of Rome. That took place later. He did make it legal. In other words, he outlawed the persecution that had been so common up until that point. It was very common to persecute Christians in the first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire. Now, what's interesting about this moment is that some people look at this and think, wow, this is a real great triumph of Christianity. Others look at this and say, no, this is the moment where Christianity ceased being relevant, at least in a very broad sense. And it's a very interesting discussion, I think, and one worthy of a lot of talk, far more than we have right now, but it's something to keep in mind if you're ever looking at world history topics. It was on this date in 1878 that Charles Streit invented the pop-up toaster. So when were Pop-Tarts invented? I don't know. But, banks have never been the same since. But yeah, on this date, 1878, Charles Streit is born. He's the creator of the pop-up toaster. It's also Elizabeth Taylor's birthday. The actress, National Velvet, Butterfield 8, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, married to Richard Burton, married to a U.S. Senator for a while there. But Elizabeth Taylor was born on this date in 1932. And 2 years later, Ralph Nader was born. Ralph Nader, born on this date in 1934, famous consumer advocate, wrote the book Unsafe at Any Speed, later became a presidential candidate, and is credited as having taken enough votes away from Democratic presidential aspirants in the 2000 election to give it to George W. Bush. Some of you may remember that contested election with the hanging chads and all that good stuff. But he was born on this date in 1934. So happy birthday to Ralph Nader, Elizabeth Taylor, Charles Streit, and Constantine. Okay, well, today we're going to talk about Luke chapter 6. Going to get into some of the Sabbath controversies, as well as talking about the Sermon on the Plain. So let's get back to talking about that. Good morning, welcome back. We're here today to continue our discussion of Luke, and today we're going to talk about Luke chapter 6. And if we kind of go back and talk about what we've been through before, again, we had several examples of Luke kind of ticking off the boxes. You talk about the birth of Jesus, the birth of John the Baptist, and all of that. And then last week we talked about Jesus at Nazareth, where he brings out that passage from Isaiah 61 and Isaiah 58, pointing out that that the fulfillment of this prophecy that Isaiah had given about the reclamation of Israel, the consolation of Israel, as Simeon would call it, had begun, and it had begun with him. And how that turned the people in Nazareth against him. But then he went on to talking about different... he went in and talked in other communities, at other synagogues. He drives out an impure spirit. Then he calls his first disciples. We talked about that last week, where he talked about them. Heals a man with leprosy, heals a paralyzed man, etc. And the call of Levi, eating with sinners, and questions about fasting is what we talked about last week. Okay, so this week we're going to get into Luke chapter 6, and continuing a couple of Sabbath controversies here, beginning in verse 1. And we know it's a Sabbath controversy because it starts off one Sabbath. Now, before we go any further talking about this, remember what we talked about or before we go any further, I just kind of want to mention something about the Sabbath, okay? And that is to just kind of remind how important the Sabbath was to the Jewish religious system, okay? So the Pharisees' protection of the Sabbath was not just that they were, people, worried that someone somewhere might be having fun. Okay, the Sabbath is set up in the Old Testament, and it does two things. One, it is a constant reminder to the Jews that they're not slaves anymore, because a slave had to work 7 days. Slaves didn't get a day off. That's kind of what being a slave is, right? You're just working 7 days. And so one of the things that the Sabbath was meant to illustrate to the Jews was that they're not slaves anymore. And coupled with that is that the reason that the Jews are not slaves anymore was because God had rescued them. Okay, so the Sabbath was a constant reminder of God's protection of the nation of Israel. Okay, and it was a way, it was a tangible way for the Jewish nation, Jewish believers, Jewish adherents, I should say, to remember God's role in their life, okay? And to eschew that, or to eliminate that, or to ignore that, was tantamount to saying, well, God isn't really that important in our life. And so the Pharisees, among other things, were very adamant about protecting the Sabbath. Now, in our society, in Western Protestant society, we do not honor the Sabbath, so to speak, for a number of reasons, and we don't have time to go into them now. We have switched to Sunday, okay? But the concept of having a week, a day off, a day of rest, so to speak, to focus on God's provision and on God's control, on God's preservation of us, is certainly something well worth keeping. And I know there's been some really interesting studies done on that. I know a year or so ago, there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal where somebody was talking about the benefit of keeping the Sabbath, keeping a Sabbath, just taking a break, taking a regular break from everything, in order to just kind of refocus on God's provision, okay? So again, the Pharisees are not just simply, nattering nabobs of negativism, okay? Their goal is this constant, to protect this reminder that God is in control, that God has protected them, okay? So I say that because, again, the Pharisees, I mentioned it before, the Pharisees are the good guys. Within the Jewish religious tradition, the Pharisees are the good guys. They're very pro-Israel. They're very pro and very nationalistic in that sense. They are very pro Old Testament. They follow the law. They really want to create the nation that God wanted them to create. Okay, and so they see anything that has veers from that, deviates from that, as a great threat to their conception of what God's rule is. And what we're going to see today is that in their zeal to protect these religious traditions, they have kind of stepped over the line. They've gone overboard, okay? And we're going to kind of see that as we talk today, okay? So beginning in Luke chapter 6, we have the first one where we talk about being the Lord of the Sabbath. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. Okay, so get the idea. So maybe it's lunchtime, whatever. And one of the Old Testament laws was that, if you had a field where you would grow grain, that the edges needed to be left unreaped, I guess, so to speak, so that the poor could come by and do exactly what the disciples were doing, grab the grain and make food out of them. Okay, so apparently what they're doing, and I don't know the exact details of this, but apparently just based on the text, they're grabbing it and they're kind of making it edible in a way by doing it. Now, to the Pharisees, seeing this is threshing, okay? They're going beyond simply taking something and putting it in their mouth. They're taking something, they're doing something to it, and then they're eating it. And it's the doing something to it that in the mind of the Pharisees is a violation of their interpretation of the Old Testament law. And that is that you could not work on the Sabbath. Okay? So he says in verse 2, some of the Pharisees, some, interesting phrase there, some of the Pharisees, not all, but some of the Pharisees said, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Okay? So it's interesting. So there isn't an indication of that Jesus is doing it. It's that his disciples are doing it. Okay? And then the Pharisees ask, so the implication is they're asking the disciples, because they say, why are you doing what is unlawful? But Jesus answers. Okay, Jesus answered, verse 3. Jesus answered them, have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? Now this is a story from 1 Samuel 21. He entered the house of God, and taking the consecrated bread, he ate what is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Okay. All right, let's talk about this for a second. Now, this is a story. David is running from David is running from Saul. He goes to the temple. He says, give me something to eat. The priests in the temple say, I don't have any regular food. We just have this consecrated bread over here. And David says, well, let me eat that. Now, it's questionable whether or not this is, how illegal this was. It was unusual. Okay, this was a practice. Now, whether there was an actual law to it that had developed or not is really unclear. But it certainly was unusual. And I think what this story does is it links Jesus with David, the actions of David, and says, listen, you cannot be hyper applying these rules here, okay? Because he says in verse 5, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, you can look at this two different ways, and it has to do with what the Son of Man means. Now, and I think we've talked about this before, but generally the phrase Son of Man comes from a reference in Daniel, where Daniel sees a vision of one like a Son of Man, and that vision clearly indicates divinity. Some have looked at that phrase in Daniel and thought that that's a Christophany, a pre-incarnate picture of Christ or appearance of Christ. It's certainly a theophany, that somehow God is exhibited in a human form. But prior to this, the phrase Son of Man is often used to reference God himself. Okay, but Son of Man can also be used to mean representative man, okay, or humankind. In a sense, okay? So if you've ever read the Chronicles of Narnia, especially The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first one when they come in there, the Pevensey children are constantly referred to as son of Adam, son of Eve. Representative Adam, representative Eve, representative man, representative woman, okay? And so you can look at this and see that, perhaps, Jesus is saying, listen, I'm above this, and that would be true. But I think it's also accurate to say that he's pointing out that the Sabbath was made as a benefit for humans, okay? And we don't want to make the rule more important than what the real reason for the rule is, okay? So again, this is not what the Pharisees want to hear, okay? The Pharisees want to hear that they're protecting, why aren't you honoring God? Okay? But the Lord says, no, really we need to think about what is really being honored here. Okay? So, and then we have a second Sabbath controversy beginning in verse 6. On another Sabbath, he went into the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was shriveled. Okay? So there's something with his hand. I don't know. I'm not trying to, minimize it or anything. It was something about his hand isn't working. Now, was it injured? Is it a birth defect? We don't know. All we know is there's this man there. Now, we've seen throughout, even up until this point in Luke chapter 6, that people who have deformities, have sicknesses, illnesses, come to Jesus for healing. Okay? And so if you put Jesus in a room with somebody who needs healing in one form or another, the expectation is that a healing is going to take place. And that's exactly what happens here. Okay? The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. Okay? So they're clearly looking for something. They're clearly antagonistic at this point. Okay? They don't see Jesus as a friend. They don't see Jesus as somebody who is upholding their vision of Judaism. Okay? So they're looking for something. Okay? So they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus knew what they were thinking and said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Get up and stand in front of everyone." So he got up and stood there. Okay, so now you've got this man is in the center of the room. All attention is on this man. And the big question is, what is Jesus going to do? Okay. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil, to save a life or to destroy it?" Okay, now the moment here, in the moment, at the time, Jesus is clearly implying that to not do something for this man with the shriveled hand would be evil. Okay, and the Pharisees are looking at this what they think is going to be a violation of the Old Testament law as being the evil, and Jesus is pointing out, no, to not do something is evil here. He looked around at them all and then said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was completely restored. Okay, so the idea of restored makes me think that it was some sort of an injury that had happened to him, but it could have been a birth defect. We don't know. But his hand is completely restored. Okay? But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were furious. Okay? And I think they were furious here for a couple of reasons. And this is the same idea that the people in Nazareth, they were furious at Jesus because Jesus had turned the argument against them. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They were outthought. They were outmaneuvered here. Okay? But they began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. So this is like the beginning of the conspiracy, so to speak. But this is where they're like, what are we going to do with this guy? This guy is nothing but trouble for us. Okay. Now, another thought about the Sabbath here, that Jesus clearly showing the role of the Sabbath, that the Sabbath is something that it does picture honoring God. It does picture God's protection, but it does not indicate this sort of devotion that has to be followed. Okay. Now, looking at it from the perspective of the readers, and again, Luke is the gospel to the rest of us. Luke is the gospel for outcasts. They're reading this and they're going, okay, great. So we're not really obligated to follow this law in the same way, this Old Testament law in the same way the Jews were. Okay, so this would have been good news to them. So now that this conspiracy has begun, we see Jesus choosing his apostles. One of those days, Jesus went out to the mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. Okay, now this is the second time we've seen Jesus spending the night praying here in Luke, and usually that precedes something. And here he comes in beginning with verse 13. When morning came, he called his disciples to him. Now his disciples are a larger group. Now later on, we're going to see there's at least 72 of them. But of this group, he picks out 12. Okay, he picks out 12. And chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Interesting thought here. Now, apostles simply means sent ones. Okay? And there are multiple people. I think there's like 19 people in the New Testament that are referred to as apostles, including Priscilla. Okay, in Acts. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is the other gospel accounts talk about the calling of the apostles, the 12 disciples, the 12 apostles, but they don't refer to this designating them apostles. Okay, so some have looked at this and said, well, gee, what does that mean? What is Luke trying to say? And I think the answer just has to do with Luke's relation to Paul. If you remember, if you know Paul in his ministry going into the book of Acts, and even in his writings, one of the things that he was very particular about was his calling as an apostle. And so as Luke is telling Paul's story here, what Paul knows about the life of Jesus and what he's been able to verify, he's pointing out, and I think that's why the apostle designation is there. Because later on we see that they're referred to again as the disciples, and then there's a larger number of them. So, but looking at the list, here's the 12. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Okay. Now, the thought that, and I mentioned it before, here it said Simon, whom he named Peter. So Luke, at this point, makes it clear that you know that Simon and Peter are the same person. Okay, so when he heals Simon's mother-in-law, that's Peter. When he gets in Simon's boat, that's Peter. Okay, and later on we'll see Peter. He's just referred to as mostly as Peter from this, and certainly into the book of Acts, he's referred to as Peter. Okay, but when he gets to Matthew, he talks about Matthew. He doesn't say Matthew, also known as Levi. And that's what makes me, again, this is my opinion, what makes me think that the calling of Matthew in Luke, the calling of Levi in Luke is a different event than the calling of Matthew in the other gospel accounts. But again, just my opinion, because Luke doesn't distinguish it here when he does distinguish Simon and Peter. Okay, so he's in a mode to distinguish names, make clear who's who, but he doesn't distinguish Levi being Matthew. So that's just my opinion there. So he picks out these 12. So at this point, there's 12. So we know that amongst this group of disciples that are following Jesus, this crowd that is regularly following Jesus, there are 12 that are kind of special. Okay? And they're the 12 disciples. And you can go through, and there's studies about how they're all named in other places and the order and stuff like that. And that's all great. But we've got these 12. So now, in verse 17, having named these 12 and having this crowd, we have in Luke what is often referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. He went down with them and stood on a level place, hence the plain, verse 17. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem, and from the coastal region around Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. Those troubled by impure spirits were cured, and the people all tried to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all. So again, these are, Tyre and Sidon are far out. There's a lot of Gentile influence there. Okay, so again, the gospel for the rest of us. Jesus' ministry is appealing beyond simply your normal Jewish borders or within your normal Jewish borders, okay? Now, let me just say this. Now, we have a series of teachings here, okay? And it's probably the most concentrated area of Jesus' just straight teaching that you have in Luke. Everything else is just kind of like, here, Jesus went here, he said this. Jesus went here, he said this. Now, this is the time where Jesus says this. Now, looking at this, it's very easy for people to look at this and say, oh, well, this is just an abbreviated version of the Sermon on the Mount. And the idea is that, and the Sermon on the Mount, you remember from Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Very critical section of Jesus' teaching in the book of Matthew. There are some religious denominations, like the Mennonites, who look at Matthew 5, 6, and 7 and say, that is the gospel. That is what we're supposed to do. And it kind of becomes that the Bible is inspired, but the Sermon on the Mount is more inspired. You have this canon within a canon idea. Okay? And so some have looked at the Luke's here, the Sermon on the Plain, and said that, well, you know what? Jesus is, what Luke is doing is he's got Matthew's account, and he sees what Matthew wrote, and he's like, okay, this is what's important for my readers. Now, that may have been what happened, okay? There's another idea that there was other writings. And again, we know he was looking at other writings, okay? So perhaps he was looking at this other writings, and perhaps these other writings are just a series of sayings by Jesus, and Luke just kind of creates this message, okay? I doubt that, but again, I suppose it's possible, but I doubt it worked like that. I just think here that this is just a different message, okay? Now, it could be Luke's commentary, Luke kind of rearranging the Sermon on the Mount. I don't think so. I just think this is a different message. And this is completely understandable. If you've ever followed an evangelist, okay, you know that that evangelist will preach the same message or similar messages and will adapt the message based on the group he's talking to. Okay, so when I was a kid, I worked at a camp in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and you would see these, and every summer we would have like 5 or 6 youth weeks. Okay, it was a church camp. We would have 5 or 6 youth weeks where teenagers would come, and there would be several hundred every week. And you would get these. You had a couple of evangelists who were regulars there, and they would come in, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they would preach this particular message, and then the next week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they would preach the same message. But it wasn't always exactly the same. Sometimes the stories were different. Sometimes there would be, because the preacher knew somebody in this second week group, he would say it differently. Okay, basically it was the same message, but he would say it a little bit differently. Okay, and then another thing to say is that any preacher who has preached any length of time will tell you, the themes keep coming up over and over again. Again, I've said this before. I had a boss once who described management as same problem, different face. Okay, and I think to a certain extent, preaching on a regular basis like that is the same thing. It's the same sermon, same message, different face, different place. Okay, there's only so much you can say differently, and especially if your goal, if your burden is to see people saved, that eventually you're going to bring most of your text, not all, but most of your texts are going to come down to a salvation appeal, okay, which is going to sound very much alike. Not exactly the same, so you don't have to say that one is a corruption of the other. It's just two different ways of saying the same thing, okay? So I think that's what we have here, okay? And so I am of the opinion that this is a separate message from the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, and you can put them together and you can come up with a teachings of Jesus idea. But I think we need to look at this and say, okay, what is Luke saying to his readers about this? Okay, now you can spend days and days and days and days on this. And so I'm just going to kind of get through here because I want to get all the way through Luke chapter 6 today. So again, I'm not giving this the detail that it really could get. So I encourage you to look into it more if you're interested. So looking at his disciples, he said, now, so who is Jesus addressing? So he's got his disciples, and we know it's more than just the 12. So there's probably a large group, 100 maybe. I would say it's easily 100 because later he's going to pull out 72 from that. So there were some that it suggested there were some that were left behind. So I think there's easily 100 people there that are following it. And he's going to, based on these things that they've already seen, he's going to start laying down the groundwork of God's kingdom. And here's what his message is. Okay. And the first part, we have several blessings. Okay. Sort of like Beatitudes. Okay. You have the Beatitudes in here. But the thing about these Beatitudes is they're very counterintuitive. Okay, so you think about it in the moment. Let's go to the first one. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Okay, now wait a minute. How could the poor be blessed? Okay, the basic idea from Job up through this time is that the way God showed his blessing to you was through material goods. And a person who did not have material goods or had some ailment was that way because it indicated God's disfavor. And yet Jesus is saying, no, wait a minute, it's not what you think. The poor are really blessed, okay, because theirs is the kingdom of God. They understand something about the kingdom of God that the rich don't, okay? And maybe we'll be able to get into that a little bit later. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be satisfied. Where? In the bigger picture, in the end, okay, in another life, okay, or in the next life, or at the installation, the actual installation of the kingdom, you'll be blessed. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Now, in the moment, anyone in these three categories, those who are poor, those who are hungry, those who are mourning, okay, or those who are weeping now. None of them would have said in that moment that, oh yeah, no, I'm blessed. I'm truly blessed. Yay, yay, I get to be hungry. Okay. But Jesus is looking beyond simply our immediate circumstances. And he's saying, no, it's like, it's not what you think. God's blessing isn't directed in the way you think it is. Okay. And so, again, this kind of, there's another direction you can go to this, because, the Jews were very proud of being blessed by being God's people. Okay. And so, it's like, the people who are blessed are not necessarily the people you think are being blessed. Okay. And then here in verse 22, blessed are you when people hate you. Now, how would you like it if you're a follower of somebody and that person says, oh yeah, I've got the answers to your problems. You follow me, I'll teach you what you need to know. Oh, by the way, people are going to hate you for doing this. I mean, literally hate you. Not in a snarky comment on Twitter kind of hate. I mean, they're going to kill you. They're going to want to throw things at you. They're going to want to insult you. They're going to want to throw you off a cliff and throw rocks. They're going to want to crucify you. Okay? Blessed are you, verse 22, when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you, okay, and reject your name as evil. Okay, so you're there following Jesus, and you're being treated exactly opposite of the way you think you should be. Wait a minute, I'm following Jesus, I'm following the Son of God. And the powers that be, people are saying, no, you're evil. Okay, that's not the expect. But he's saying, no, you're actually blessed because of the Son of, and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Okay, again, looking at a bigger picture here. Okay, so no one in the moment are going to pick up on this. Okay, and again, he says this now. I'm sure Jesus, being God, is aware of the Pharisees plotting. Perhaps his disciples don't see it that way. Okay, I don't know. This is speculation on my part here. Okay, rejoice in that day. What day? The day that you have all of these things where people are hate you, exclude you, insult you, reject you, because of the Son of Man. Okay, now that's a key element there. Okay, so if you do something stupid, and you think that that's you're being persecuted for your faith, no. Okay, you're being persecuted because you did something stupid. Okay, so again, there are examples of people in ministry who do financial misdeeds. Okay, and suddenly they call it and when people start asking them about these financial misdeeds, they go, oh, this is just an attack of the devil. It's like, no, you're a crook. You did something wrong. Okay, it's when the blessing comes from when all of this happens as a result of the Son of Man. And here I think it clearly referring to Jesus and his ministry. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, because great is your reward in heaven, for that is how their ancestors treated the prophets. Now in John, Jesus says that if they hate you, don't worry, they hated me first. And here Jesus is saying, listen, the prophets, the people who God used to speak truth in the past, they weren't treated well either. Okay, so as good as you see it now, and again, everything's really peachy at this point because people are coming to Jesus. He's healing them. This is great. All kinds of wonderful things are going on, and Jesus is reminding them, listen, truth bearers in the past have been killed. Okay, and as we get through Luke, we're going to see. Wait a minute, he's going to say, it's going to happen to me as well. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Okay. This is a great passage, and I would love to just spend all my time on this one right here. Okay, woe to you who are rich, and I think you could look at this. Those of you who have a lot of money, okay, that certainly is the rich. But I think it's also those who take comfort in or take security in their riches. Okay, or those of you who think you're rich because you're blessed by God. It's like, okay, there you go. There it is. You got your reward, kind of stuff. And I think I think this is really a fascinating idea. He says, woe to you, because that's it. You got your reward. Okay. There's another passage. Well, okay, I gotta move on here. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you will go hungry. So again, this is the opposite of what we would think. Okay. So, here, woe to you who laugh now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. So you see, the 4 woes here are the opposite of the 4 blessings. Okay, so blessed are the poor, woe to those who are rich. Blessed are those who hunger, woe to those who are well fed. Okay, so your appearance is not an indication of how well God is pleased with what you're doing. Okay, so you just can't go based on that. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. I think Soren Kierkegaard once wrote a book, I think, called "With the Crowd is Untruth." Okay, or the crowd is untruth. That if everybody is pleased with you, something isn't right. Okay, something isn't right, and I don't want to get all purist here and suggest that if you're very successful in your ministry, or if you have a church that's got 10,000 people, then clearly you're doing something wrong relative to God, because you can't have that many people liking you. Okay, but I think there is something to be said about, like, if you're not stirring up hornet's nest somewhere with your ministry, then you're not doing something right, because Jesus certainly did. Okay, Jesus certainly upset a lot of people. All right, but to you who are listening, verse 27. Okay, and again, here's disciples, and I'm thinking by Luke bringing it out, his original readers. Love your enemies. Okay, now love your enemies is a really interesting phrase, because of all the things you want to do to your enemies, loving them is not usually one of them. Okay, and we have watered this down as I love your enemies. It's like, okay, don't be as bad as you can be to them. But I think he's like really being. I think this is kind of an illustration of just the radicalness of Jesus, approach to life, of the message Jesus is bringing, the message of the kingdom. Okay, it isn't to fall into these patterns of life that we've fallen into. It's like, love your enemies. Okay, do good to those who hate you. Okay, there's an action element here. Do good. Remember, I said we're going to talk about this. This comes up a lot in Luke. And what should I do? Do good. Okay, do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Okay, really, is that our first thought? No. And so this just kind of talks about this radical countercultural, even within the Jewish tradition. This is countercultural. It's countercultural in 2022. It was countercultural then. Okay, it was perfectly fine for the Jews. If you had an enemy, okay, we don't have to like him. He or she is our enemy. Jesus is going, no, that's not what the kingdom is about. Okay. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Remember what John the Baptist said? What should we do? Well, if you have 2 coats and your neighbor has none, give him one. Okay, Jesus is kind of echoing the same idea. Okay, if somebody takes your coat, here, just think. I think of this story, and again, this is fiction. In Les Miserables, that Jean Valjean gets out of prison and he goes and he stays at this priest's house, and he robs the priest at night, and he's captured and he's brought back. Okay, and the priest has an opportunity to get back the stuff that Jean Valjean has stolen, but instead he says, "No, wait a minute, you forgot the rest." Okay, and he gives him the brass candlesticks, or the golden candle, or silver candlesticks. I think they're silver. Again, that's fiction. I get it. That's fiction. But the point here is to just kind of show this radical love for somebody who meant him ill. Okay. Now, this clearly doesn't always work out. Okay. I get that. I completely understand that. But that's not the promise that God is making. Or God never promises that things are going to work out well for us in this life. I'm going to get to that in a minute. Verse 30, give to everyone who asks you. And if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Okay, so how many times have we had situations where somebody has, maybe you've been robbed, and you know maybe in the movies, or maybe there are examples of where rich people rob others, and I get that, you know but I think here again, going back to that priest in Hugo's Les Miserables, it's like, hey, if somebody's robbing you, chances are he or she is in desperate straits. Okay, now I'm not suggesting that you leave your doors unlocked and all of that, but kind of keep in mind that people are hurting and we should be helping them. Give to everyone that demands it. Where was it here? Give to everyone who asks you. Okay, now I'm not going to follow this up by coming up to you and say, hey, can you give me $5? And I think there's, talking about helping the poor here. I think that's clearly the implication, those who help. And again, we've gotten this habit of just kind of assuming that, oh, we can't give money to the poor. We can't give money to the person on the street that asks us. And all of us have had this situation because we've convinced ourselves that we don't need to do that because he or she isn't going to use the money the way we want to, or we think should be. Okay? And that may be 100% accurate, but the text does not say, give to anyone who asks you, provided you're certain they use the money the way you want them to. Okay? They may use the money wrongly. They may take your gift wrongly. That's true. But that's not your concern. Okay? That's not your concern. That's not what a gift is. Okay? So, we've lost this idea of giving, that a giving is you, once you give something away, it's gone. Okay? You don't have control over it. If you still have control over it, it's not a gift. At best, it's a loan. Okay? This is why, this is my side pet peeve. I don't like the idea of designated gifts in a church. It's like, you know what? Just, if you're going to give money to the church, give money to the church. And once you give it, it's gone. If you get up there and say, oh, I gave X amount of dollars and I demand this be done, well, then you didn't give it. You're using it as a method of control here. Okay? I'm sorry. Verse 32, and this is kind of just an interesting explanation of this whole thing. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. Okay? You ever think about that? It's like, there were, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, all these guys, they had loved ones. They had people that they bought Christmas presents for and birthday presents for and did nice things for. And there are people that look fondly on all of those guys that the rest of history looks at it with askance, and these guys were monsters, are monsters, in the human sense. And yet there were people, even... So the fact that you do nice things for those who love you, so what? Big deal. Everybody does that. I'm not, and you should. Don't get me wrong. So, buy birthday presents for those you love and all that. That's great. But don't go to God and say, hey, you know what? Hey God, I need a special blessing because I got my significant other a Valentine's Day present. Okay, even the unrighteous do that. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Getting back to the thing. Getting back to the idea of give to anyone who asks you. Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies. Love your enemies. Okay? These are people who wish you ill. You should wish them good. Do good to them and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great. And you will be children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Okay? Just moving on, I'm running out of time here. Verse 37. Do not judge and you will not be judged. Okay? Okay, so here's, and again, I think he's looking at this within the context of when you see an enemy, don't judge the enemy and just decide, okay, well, this person doesn't deserve my help. So, no, and yet there is still other passages where we said, and I think the point here is that if you're judgmental, people are going to be judgmental to you, and you're going to deserve it. Okay? Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Okay, this is kind of going back to several other passages. The Lord's Prayer. And we'll get to that later in Luke, because there's a version in Luke as well. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those. Forgive us our trespasses. It's a King James, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Okay, so if you want to be forgiven, you should be forgiving. Okay. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Now, tricky passage here. Okay. Used by a lot of people for a lot of different things. Okay. Now, keep in mind that when God is talking about blessings, God is the one who defines what a blessing is. Okay. We quote Romans 8, all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. That's very true. That absolutely is true. This verse is absolutely true. But it's God who's defining what the blessing is, not us. So this is not a promise to say, listen, if you give $10 to this particular ministry, God is going to give you $100 back. And it doesn't matter that there's 50 examples of people who gave $10 to this ministry and you got $100 back. Okay? That may have happened, because things happen. All right? But that isn't a promise that you're going to get. This isn't God playing the roulette wheel here. Okay? God's instruction on how to gamble. Okay? So if you go to a service and say, listen, if you're hurting, if you're poor, and I say that because this passage has been used and abused by a lot of people who to get money out of people who shouldn't be giving money. Okay, we'll talk about the widow in 2 months later, kind of that sort of idea. Okay, but God is saying, listen, if you want to be blessed, be a blessing. Okay, don't sit down. It isn't bless me, God, and I'll be a blessing. It's be a blessing, and God will bless you. Okay, love your enemies, and you will be loved. Okay, and God is the one who's defining the blessing. Okay, it may not be until we're in heaven. Okay, but again, to look at this passage and go, oh, that means I'm going to get rich if I give money to this particular thing. You're misusing this passage. Okay, I'm just telling you, that is a misuse of this particular passage. He also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. And I think, here there's a couple of messages going out here. Again, it isn't an indictment on the visually impaired. Okay, I mean, I think he's clearly dealing, using this illustration to talk about just making sure you're clear who you're following. Okay, now it's fairly, it's speculation, but I don't think it's unreasonable speculation to suggest that there are Pharisees and teachers of the law around the outside of this group, because every time you turn around, you see them there. Okay, they're following around. Maybe 1 or 2 Pharisees have become disciples. Okay, we don't know of the 72. Maybe 1 or 2 of them are. Okay, but I think he's kind of telling the people, pay attention to who you're following. Okay, and then going, Jesus later on, certainly in John, I am the light of the world. But here, be careful about who you're following. Okay, verse 41. A very well-known passage here. I'm going to finish up with this here. No, I'm not going to finish up with this. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Okay? Now, this is interesting, and we know all of this, and we've seen these illustrations all over the place, but think about what this passage is saying. Okay? This passage is not saying that if you see something, a speck in your brother's eye, if you see something that needs to be pointed out, it's not saying don't point it out. Okay? It's not saying don't point it out. It's saying don't point it out without making sure that you don't have the same problem, or don't point it out without making sure you don't have a bigger problem. Okay, and this is, and this seems an obvious point, and yet over and over again you hear stories of people that on the one hand are excoriating somebody for some act that they themselves are guilty of doing. Again, there was going back to that book I read about the PTL Club not too long ago. There was a story about Jimmy Swaggart, who was excoriating and had really taken it upon himself to put this guy out of ministry, who had a checkered past in relationship to women, that he had affairs or something. I don't remember all the details, but what I remember about the story is that at the same time that Jimmy Swaggart was sitting across the table from this guy telling him he needs to be out of ministry because of his problems with women, Jimmy Swaggart was cruising to hotels looking for prostitutes. Okay? That's removing the plank in your own eye. Did the other guy? Probably. I don't know. Okay? I'm not going to get into that. But it's like, you know what? Do not go judging people. And again, Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's like, he's going to let them loose. He's like, okay, don't go hammering on someone else's faults when you have the same fault. Okay? Don't do that. Just don't do that. Okay? Don't do that. Because it says, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Okay, so again, I'm not saying you don't. That's not a blanket condemnation. Well, don't go judging any. Don't go looking at the speck. It's like, if you're going to judge, if you're going to be critical, if you're going to point out the speck in your brother's eye, you better make sure that it's not in your own eye. Okay. I guess I'm not going to finish with this either. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is recognized by its own fruit. Duh. Okay, if I see an apple hanging on a tree, I don't have to sit there and say to myself, what kind of orange tree is this? Okay, now I get that there's like a bazillion different kind of apples. Okay, but I know if it's an orange that it's not an apple tree. Okay, you know it by their fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes or grapes from briars. A good man brings good things out of the good stored up in his heart, and an evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored up in his heart, for the mouth speaks what the heart is full of. And this is going back to, why would you treat your enemy with anything but love? Because how you treat him or her is an indication of what's inside of you. One of my favorite statements, you see it all the time. Somebody says something stupid, and he or she is called on the carpet for it, gets blasted on Twitter or whatever. And they reply that, oh, I said something, but that doesn't reflect my values. Okay. Well, yeah, it does. That's why you said it. Okay. Now, again, I get that there's considerations there, but still, it's like, here's what he's saying. Now, I'm going to finish with this. Okay. Basically, wise man builds his house on a rock. Verse 46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? In the short time that Jesus has been ministering, he's already seen a disconnect between people saying, hey, I really like what you're talking about, but yet not putting it into practice already in this short period of time. So the story goes, and again, it's just an anecdote, but a story goes of a preacher gets up and preaches a sermon. And everybody, thanks him on the way out. And then the next week he comes out and he preaches the exact same sermon. And then, the deacons are kind of going, what's that? Okay, no. So the third week the pastor comes up and he preaches the same sermon a third week in a row. Exact same sermon, okay? Finally, the head of the deacon board goes up to him and says, Pastor, we couldn't help but notice that, it was a great sermon you preached today, but I couldn't help but notice that it was the same sermon as the week ago, and it was the same sermon as the week before that. We were just kind of wondering if there's an issue here. And the pastor's response was something to the effect of, well, when you start following this one, I'll move on to the next message, kind of thing. Again, I don't know that that's true or not, but verse 47, as for everyone who comes to me and hears my word and puts them into practice, so he's comparing people people that listen to him and do what he says, love your neighbor, love your enemy, do good to them that hate you, etc. I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it because it was well built. Following somebody who wasn't blind, taking into account the situation, acting accordingly, acting with love, acting as Jesus would have them act. This torment comes, so when the people are hating you, you're not going to fall because it's built on a rock. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice, which is probably the majority of the people that are actually listening to him, okay, because they like it because he talks with authority. But the one who hears my words and does not put them in practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete. All right. I'm going to pull it there. We're at the end of chapter 6. Jesus teaching, talking to his disciples, talking to his followers, talking to his apostles, saying, listen, this is what it's like. It's a radical belief. It's a radical difference of behavior. But if you do what I say for the right reasons, you're going to survive. You're going to do well. You're going to be blessed. Okay? God defines the blessing, but you will be blessed. So I hope you're blessed this week. And I know I went a little long today, but I hope to see you again here next week. Thank you very much. And any questions, let me know. Email me, Facebook message, YouTube comment, see me in church. However, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you later.